So I talked a bunch. I can now take some questions, and that will allow us all to talk together, I think. So questions about anything that I have said, or anything that I haven't said that you wish I had said. Yeah.
What do you read?
What do I read? I read everything. I cannot overstate the importance of reading if you want to be a writer. I'll have students who come to me and they don't really read. I'm like, why are you here? Go play a video game or go watch a movie. My most, I think, important teachers have been the authors that I have read. With my most recent book, with The False Friend, there were 3 authors in particular that I was reading who ended up being very important, and that was Ian McEwan, Graham Greene, and Kazuo Ishiguro. These 3 writers, I think, so Ian McEwan, he knows how to spin a yarn, man. Like, I mean, he is a page-turning reader. Like, he knows how to do suspense, and suspense is all about the very precise parceling out of information. You have to pace it perfectly. So you give your reader just enough to go on to make them want to go further, but not so much that they think they figured something out yet. So they're still curious. And I wanted to use that suspensefulness when I was writing. Graham Greene I really like because he is a master of exploring the moral gray zones that are just a part of life. He knows that there's no easy answers to anything, and he wallows in that. And the book that I was writing, The False Friend, also was kind of talking about moral and ethical quandaries. And Kazuo Ishiguro does 2 really cool things. One of them is he can use kind of a single point of perspective, a single character, to unfold an entire universe. He's really good at those first-person narratives. Remains of the Day, excellent example of that. The other thing that he does, which I think is remarkable, is he can write around an event to create a periphery and write enough of that that you as the reader can then fill it in and actually figure out what it is that he's talking about and referring to. And that does something that I think is really, really crucial for effective writing of any kind, which is establishing a collaboration between writer and reader. If as a writer you tell your reader everything, there's nothing for them to do, and they're not going to be able to have that world really be alive in their head. What you want to do as a writer is give your reader just enough so that they can complete the picture that you have started, and then because it's a collaboration, they've helped build that world inside themselves. It's going to last longer for them, it's going to feel more real to them. The trick is giving them the information that will make them complete it the way you want them to complete it. And so that's the super tricky part. Ishiguro is excellent at that, and that's something that I was wanting to do. I'll throw one more out there. José Saramago, Portuguese writer, his book Blindness is one of my favorite of all time. It's about a society that is afflicted by a sudden epidemic of blindness, and it's what happens. And he wrote that long before Hurricane Katrina happened, and then Hurricane Katrina happened, and the stories that came out of the Superdome were the stories that he was telling in that book, and it was just freaky. Like, when a fiction writer can predict how humans work to that degree, you know they're doing something right, and so I just found that a really exciting read. So there's a few other questions. Yeah?
What were you reading as a girl?
As a girl, what was I reading? Dr. Seuss, if you want to get really early. I went through this, Judy Blume, Beverly Cleary, Roald Dahl, huge, huge favorite of mine. There was this amazing book, I don't remember who it was written by, Bridge to Terabithia, which is fantastic. I read a lot of trash. I remember I read everything in the Flowers in the Attic series by B.C. Andrews, and everything that Jane Austen did, what was it called? Clan of the Cave Bear, that's it. Like, I just ate that stuff up. I read whatever, but also Watership Down. Like, I mean, I was just anything that I could get my hands on. In high school, I discovered J.D. Salinger. I discovered Milan Kundera. He did The Unbearable Lightness of Being. That was a really important guy for me to discover, because he was the first writer that I had kind of come across who was able to integrate philosophy into fiction. And the idea that you could talk about bigger ideas within a story was horribly exciting to me, and so that's why Kundera was such an important thing. Then later on, David Foster Wallace, major, major, major influence for me. I admired the hell out of him and wanted to figure out how I could write like him, realized I can't write like him, but that's okay. And that's the other thing that's really tricky, because you read someone whose voice you really admire and you think, well, the only way to be a good writer is to write with their voice. And it's not true. The only way to write like a good writer is to write with your voice, but you have to find out what that voice is. And the only way you can find that is by practicing and continuing to read. I mean, all of the people who I admire definitely are reflected in my voice, but probably in ways that only I can really see it. They all kind of combine to help contribute one little part of your writer's DNA, you know? Jeanette Winterson was a huge one for me in that regard as well. So, yeah, there's some more for you. Other questions? Well, I'll come back to you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you think about restructuring a novel by chronology versus going back and playing with a chronology?
The question is, what do I think, how to structure a novel, whether you want to do it like in a linear chronological fashion or something a little less traditional. I definitely think that every story can be told more than one way. Every story can be told in the traditional way, but then there's probably a secret structure for it that you could find that wouldn't be the conventional way. The trick, though, is you need to let your story tell you. I'm a huge, huge fan of formalism in fiction. I love writers who try to do weird stuff, who don't write linearly, who bring in extra texts, but you can always tell when they had the weird idea first, and they came up with a story that they would use to get that idea across. And those never ever work. So if you're interested in exploring unconventional ways to tell a story, it just requires a lot of patience because you've got to work with your story and let it tell you how it wants to be told rather than imposing upon it how you want it to be told. But I highly, highly encourage and value the stories that do things differently. Yeah?
Do you have any ideas on how to transform, like, what would be traditionally an academic nonfiction type of look at some social issue of using creative nonfiction techniques?
Question is, any ideas about how to transform an academic nonfiction book into something that would be more of a creative nonfiction approach? I'm a novelist. I'm not sure I can help you much there. From my experience, it seems to be you need to find a narrative. I mean, basically, when I read creative nonfiction, for me, what grabs me is it has a story to tell, and then all the interesting facts come in through this kind of strong narrative thrust that then carries me through the book. So, I think there's other ways to do it. The way that I'm most familiar is when a creative nonfiction kind of emulates the narrative structure that you might find in a novel, but that's not the only way to do it, and you should definitely talk to other people because you're getting it from a novelist who's a total story addict and loves narrative, and so is going to try. I mean, I try to find narrative in Mark Rothko paintings. I mean, that's how bad it is. But
does that mean like a beginning, middle, and like from someone's point of view? Or?
I don't. If there's people in it and you can let your reader get to know the people who are involved.
You're saying these people.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's about people. Other people, it's not going to be about people, but yeah, if you ask me, people. Yeah.
I'm revising my first novel, which probably won't be my first published novel, and when I wrote the first draft, I feel like I was using very much the voice from when I was a earnest journal writer as a kid or as a teenager.
Yeah.
So it's very, to me, solipsistic, and there are other characters, and I like the plot. But I guess I was wondering. I feel like I'm in the stage of revisioning and learning how to write. But in terms of, I find my mind doing these things where I'm like, if right now it's in the first person. I'm like,
I was about to ask you that.
I should write it in the third person.
Yes, you should.
Because it started in the third, and then I changed it at first. But now I'm thinking.
It's interesting. It turns out that every single novel I've started has always started in the first person. And then I always switch to the third person. And I never remember that's the case until I'm writing yet another novel. And it just started in first person and I'm switching it to third. And the reason I do that is because by starting in first, I can get to know my characters. Like, you can really get to know a person well if you're making yourself be in their head. But it's limited. You can only say so much looking through just one pair of eyes. And so once I feel that limitation, that's when I go to third and I can really broaden my canvas and broaden my view. And I would say especially for you, if this is a first novel that started with personal stuff and journaling, absolutely you have to get out of yourself. And the way to do that would be to put it into third person, because I think that's going to let you bring in character traits that don't belong to you because it's not your voice anymore, it's a larger voice. So I think that's a good next technique or step.
And can I just ask you, do you have any recommendations of good examples of sort of current novels that you can think of that are written in a sort of modern third-person omniscient? I can't.
What do you mean modern third person?
Well, I guess I just mean
most
whenever
novels are.
Right.
Yeah, so I think anything, just if you start opening books, it's unusual to find a novel that is first person. That kind of is striking. You'll find that most authors are using third person because of the broader scope and the broader palette it allows them to use. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit more about your process? You go from, I mean, you talked about broad strokes, 8 hours a day, and then 2.5 years later. What is going on?
That's an excellent question. What is going on? Okay. I will definitely, when I go into a book, I don't know everything that's going to happen. I don't write outlines. I've always hated outlines. And when I talk to schools and I tell those kids that I don't use outlines, they all cheer and the teachers grimace and then everyone's unhappy. For me, if I knew what was going to happen, I wouldn't want to write the book. Writing for me is a process of exploration. So my first step is to get grounded in character, to get to know at least one character really, really well, usually by starting in first person and following them around, getting to know the world really well. I usually have a beginning in mind, and then I know 1 or 2 events that are going to happen down the road. And so for me, the writing process is the process of getting there and seeing how I get there, and often what I thought was going to happen ends up changing along the way. There's the question about linear writing. Generally, I write linearly. I start at chapter 1 and then I go to chapter 2. Except this most recent one, my most recent book, there's 2 chapters that are hugely important chapters where my main character, Celia, goes to meet some important people from her past. And they came to me almost immediately. I wrote them almost before I wrote anything else, not knowing where they were going to come in the book, and then they sort of became my lodestones as I wrote, and I sort of wrote toward them, and they ended up falling in very different places in the book than I thought they would. With Bee Season, with the mother Miriam, she has certain special problems that I won't reveal to those of you who haven't read the book yet. I had no idea she was going to be as crazy as she was, and the writing process was a process of discovering that craziness. So mostly a linear approach with occasional maybe departures from linearity, sitting down and reading the chapter I wrote yesterday, revising it along the way, and then when I get to the end of those revisions, pushing forward. I think it was Joan Didion? It might have been Joan Didion who says that her writing day, she first starts from the beginning of whatever she wrote, and starts from the beginning and then reads it and revises it until she can start pushing onward. This is a woman who doesn't write many novels. I don't see how you could possibly do that if you're writing long things. So I usually start the chapter before, or if I was in the middle of a chapter, I'll start the beginning of that chapter, and I'll read it and then continue to write. Is it constant writing? Of course not. You can't literally type for 8 hours. It's not going to happen. There's pauses for thinking. I have a notebook where I will, in longhand, I will brainstorm. I'll write my idea for a character or what I think needs to happen. I'll give myself just thinking off the top of my head, she gets run over by a car, she befriends a dog, and I'll do that and just come up with lots of different things and see what sticks. And usually one of them also, all of a sudden will seem like a lot better idea than the others, and I'll go from there. Research, it's true, now that there's the land of the internet, it can be very tricky because you're like, I really need to know what the name of that street is in Philadelphia. I'll just Google it, I'll just take a minute. No. I segregate my research from my writing religiously because, as we all know, the internet is a gaping black hole of procrastination. So I only check my email, at the beginning of the day, at lunch, and at the end of the day, which is more than a lot of other people. Some people, when they write, they are not at a computer that can even go online, because if it could go online at all, that's all that they would do. Is that?
Well, what about language itself?
Okay.
You're talking about, are you writing a whole chapter, it's coming out of you, or you're sitting there sometimes struggling with a sentence just to get the sentence?
Absolutely, yes. For me, how a sentence sounds is hugely, hugely important. I'm a musician as well as being a writer, and I think that makes me particularly sensitive to assonance and meter and rhythm, and all that's super important, and it doesn't come out that way at first. My initial drafts tend to read very expository. They're very prickly, because I have these large ideas that I want to have in there, and so they start out reading very clunky, and it's just a matter of every time I go through it, I try to simplify the language without sacrificing the concepts, and that's super duper hard. I'm also addicted to metaphors, and I can get really purple with those, which is really fun when you're writing a draft and really agonizing for anyone else to read. So I'll often, in my early drafts, I'll be piling on metaphors. She was like a bird and a fish and a ball, and so then generally you gotta pick one. You know, if you got more than one going on, that's one too many. So I have to.
One per page or one?
No, one per thing. Like if you're describing something, you should probably only describe it one way. Even if you found 5 cool ways to do it, probably you need to just find one. And so that's a tendency that I find I fight. So in my revisions, I do that. So prettifying language, simplifying language. I read out loud. You must read your work out loud. I'm embarrassed to say that it only with this novel that I literally read when I had finished a draft, I read the whole thing from the first page to the last page, and I couldn't believe it took me to my 3rd novel to do that. From here on out, I promise you I will do that with every single thing I do. I mean, I read parts of it out loud, but in its entirety, I hadn't. For dialogue, reading out loud, it's kind of, self-evident why it's important, because something that looks like it might be the way they say it on the page, you actually speak it. But my dear, I don't know why and you're like, oh my God, people don't actually talk like that. And so then you can play with it in your mouth and just say that line in lots of different ways so it actually sounds like the way that people talk. And once you find that, that's what you write down. So that's super duper helpful. But also just for, the exposition parts, when you're just giving a description, say it out loud and hear how it sounds. Does it sound prickly or does it roll off your tongue? Are there too many S's in there or just the right number? And so that's another, for me, super important part of the process.
That's really helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Yeah.
You said that the beginning is one of the things that you'll have in mind before you begin a new project. Does that beginning ever change for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And in what ways?
Right, well, the example I would give you is Wicked's Remedy, where originally I had started with the childhood of the main character, Lydia, and that went on for 50, 75 pages. And then I was like, glad I wrote that, because I needed to know that, but turns out my reader doesn't. And so my beginning then ended up moving to not starting until she was actually already an adult. And so, yeah, your beginning definitely can change, because what you're going to need to know as a writer to make your characters and your story work, you're always going to need to know more than your reader needs to know.